time, it's my pleasure to start this meeting. This meeting is being sponsored by Huron County Soil and Crop. And it is also my pleasure to introduce Graham Gilchrist as our guest speaker. I spoke to him on the phone 10 days ago, maybe 2 weeks ago, when we put this all together, and I was really impressed. I talked to him for 40 minutes. I could have talked to him longer. And he was just telling me tonight, they brought their program in, started back in about 2005, he said, and he's been involved in it in 2007 in the carbon market. Very knowledgeable man. At this time, Graham, take over, please.
Well, thank you very much, Alan, and I appreciate the opportunity to present tonight and tell you a little bit of what Biological Carbon Canada is doing, and to old-fashioned farm management extension series. So that's really what I'll be doing for you tonight. I'll start my slide deck here pretty quickly. As for questions, I think we should do two things. If you don't understand something, flag it or send me a quick text on the chat function, and I'll try to answer it right away. Then when we get to the end of the slide deck, I know we're committed to record this. So I think we're better off is once the slide deck's done, we'll shut off the recording, and then we can have a Q&A that we probably shouldn't have recorded in case somebody said something bad, just to protect everybody, in that dialogue. So Ellen, if that's how it works for you, I think that's how we'll proceed. Oh, you're looks like everybody's muted. So, okay. Hang on here while I'll share my screen and we'll get going here. Well, thank you, everybody. And my conversation tonight with folks, thank you for joining us, is really around the markets. And I want to explain more that carbon is not just the levy system, and that we were talking about Bill 234 now, putting the exemptions back on farm use of natural gas and propane, and some of the background. I represent and I work for a little nonprofit called Biological Carbon Canada. We're registered here in Alberta as a society, but we're taking on the challenge across Canada of the marketplace. So my board would certainly remind me to ask if you want to be a member of us, please sign up and we'll get that organized. Our board is across Canada, and you can see it on our website. And at the end of the day, we're doing this work coming out of what we learned with Alberta. And now that we've got a fungible system starting to be in place across Canada with the backstop provinces and the other provinces, you've got a brand new commodity in the regulatory side, and we've got three other markets that you're going to have to be aware of, all dealing with the carbon and near carbon attributes. So we'll talk a bit about that. I want to make sure we're on the same page. And what I mean by that is when we're talking about farm emissions, we're talking about both the emissions being generated, and we have some sink data to also indicate that farms are making a difference slowly with improving their scopes and sinks, and we have some problems keeping acres into the system. But I'll show you what's going on and why it's important. Right, this is coming out of the 2019 National Inventory Report. To give you a size and scope, agriculture, to be clear, is not a big player in the emissions in Canada. Most of the energy we consume, all the way from making electricity to driving down the Starbucks, is in there. The net emissions from agriculture sits around 8%. And then if we look at the shrinking of the land use changes we have across Canada, it's now big enough to show up as 1% of the emissions framework. And what I mean by that is the minute Environment Canada sees an acre leave agriculture, those sinks, loss of sinks, are treated as an emission. Give you a size and scope of the gas. Now, the big three are carbon dioxide, methane, and nitrous oxide. And for most part, for the CO2 gases, we're not a big player. We're less than 1%. We're 0.5% of what we do in our sector. But where we our Achilles heel are in two parts. The amount of methane we produce in Canada, agriculture is the 29% of that size. And then we look at our nitrogen oxide emissions, we're 78% of that challenge. So those are the two gases really we've got to get a handle on as a sector. Some of them are going to be more difficult than others, but to realize those are the gases in the inventory that we've got to deal with. So what does that mean on a continuing perspective? Well, this is the NIR data back to 1990. We've got the blue line there is the gross emissions. We're just under 60 million tons of CO2e in Canada from the agriculture sector. We have a sink that has been dropping nicely until about 2006. And then we started to see losses of farmland across Canada. That put the green line going the wrong direction. It was going back up. So as you see the net sink, the orange line bouncing right along, coming down, going back up, and we're sitting at about 55 million tons of CO2e by the time we get to the 2019 part of the report. What's happening behind? Nope, we got a question here. On the Messide side, what is the enteric? Okay, just answering that right now. So the enteric fermentation is the blue line, and it's the biggest across Canada. It matches though the cow herd, both on the dairy and the non-dairy side. So it peaked in 2005, and then it's come back down, sitting just below 25 million. Our fertilizers and fuels across Canada are continuing to increase, really since 2019, 2090, I should say, and we're moving back up. Our manure is matching what's happened. Mainly that's our methane gas as well, matching the cow herd. We've got liming, we've got burning fields, and then the sink stuff on the bottom. Oop. When I look at what's happening in province, Alberta's on the top, Saskatchewan, Ontario, then is the green line, Quebec, the next below that, Manitoba is the light blue, and then we get to BC and the rest of the provinces. So you get a handle on most of the emission growth in the field crop side has been Saskatchewan. Alberta jumps up and down depending on how many feeder animals we have here. Quebec and Ontario down your neck of the woods has been relatively static. For most part, Manitoba has had some growth. BC is relatively static, and then when we look at the rest of the provinces further east of you, they're hard to put on the graph. And on the emissions side, there's probably some good news stories here for your neck of the woods. Alberta, BC, Saskatchewan, and Manitoba has had the most growth since we started measuring in 1990. Ontario's had a small decrease. Quebec's going up a bit, and then we get to the rest of the provinces. They're kind of hard to see on the same scale of the graph here. But what it means from a policy perspective, it's difficult to put things across on a national basis, because you're starting to realize that you're going to need a policy at some point in time to deal with emissions in Western Canada, and you have a different set of emission challenges. And once I guess past Manitoba, down in your neck of the woods, Alan, and up the St. Lawrence Seaway. What's happening is for most part, you're seeing demand with diesel and fuels. This is the demand from Canada, and right now you've seen a fairly steady growth of farm diesel. We've got a slight increase in farm gas being used. Natural gas is there. We've got power, and then we've got propane. So these are the main instruments of emissions, particularly in our NO2 side. And they also have CO2. And as a result, if it shows that where we are and what the challenges are going to be. So in the case of Ontario, out of the same graph, farm diesel use has gone up and down, but you're relatively steady. Farm gas shrink by looking at the data, but you've had an increase in natural gas use, particularly since 2010, and that's driving some of the emission challenges in down your way. We've got power, roughly the data is somewhat static, and depending on what you're doing, propane use has gone up a bit. And so that's driving some of the emissions pictures on the farmscape. And if I look at Quebec, and why I put the two together is because in the National Inventory Report on the ecozone, both Ontario and Quebec are lumped into the same pot here. So Quebec, you've got a real rise in farm diesel over the same time period. Farm gas goes up and down. Natural gas, very little use for their demand. Power and the natural gas, I should say, the emissions behind electricity are in there, and you have a large sector. They use probably more propane than natural gas. So all those carbon fuels are in behind the numbers behind what's on the emissions framework. The other thing we have to deal with is the change in soil carbon. Part of this is reduction in soil carbon. The other half in this is also dealing with the loss of farmable acres. So it again shows two policies. You've got, for most part in Western Canada, you've got an increase through most of the ecozones, with the exception of the Interlake region around Manitoba and a few places up in the Peace. And then we've got a second policy down your neck of the woods. There are some green spaces down your way, but for most part, you're losing soil organic carbon through most of the St. Lawrence Seaway, and we don't see it. We don't see any improvements in soil carbon till we get out to the very far end of New Brunswick and for parts of Nova Scotia. So it's the challenge then is I've run two maps here, one policy one and policy two, but at the end of the day, it's going to be down really to beyond that to say, are you dealing with greenhouse gas emission reductions, or are you dealing with making sure that the soil stays on the farm where it's supposed to, and number two, it's not heading down a river or being eroded. The greenhouse gas sink changes. So we've done this, and there's not enough to reason why I don't have your neck of the woods, Alan, particularly at St. Lawrence Seaway, is because they're lumped together in the same ecozone. So what's happening in the sink change is we are seeing, for most part until 2006, the ecozones across most of Canada have been negative, with some challenges in your neck of the woods to be consistently positive, or you're emitting to that. Reason why you're seeing your rest of Canada, St. Lawrence Seaway and so forth on the top part of the graph is we're challenged with losing farmland out of the whole system. I got a chat here. Is the energy demand per farm basis? That was a look at the demand of the sector as a whole. So from that energy graph. So if I can answer that. And then by the time we get to 2006, we had a major change in Western Canada, really, on the loss of particularly farmland and arboreals. And as a result, the sink changes become mainly positive from about 2006 on. And if I highlighted in red here, then what's happening in Eastern Canada, particularly the St. Lawrence Seaway, you're seeing that in red. So I just redid the graph and show you that you've consistently had a challenge of your sinks are continuing to shrink along the St. Lawrence Seaway. And if I look at cropland changes, this is what's really says the picture. We've had not a lot of change until about 2006 across Canada. And then by the time 2007 came in, we had a fairly large loss of farmland, and particularly in Western Canada, some loss in your neck of the woods, Alan. And it's now to the point where even if on a farm on an incremental acre basis, you might be gaining in your soil sink, every acre taken out of production and moved to settlement or urbanized is we don't have enough on our acre per acre basis to counteract the loss of farmable land to urban development. And the red there is what's happening in Ontario and Quebec. Why this is important is and why I was switching gears here and moving into the farm management side of things is this is the Canadian farm on a gross basis. You've got the green line at the top there being revenue, and you've got all the different expense categories from your direct expenses, your cost of goods sold, interest, and so forth. So it has maintained a fairly a margin between the two all along. Now, somebody would certainly argue that margin should be bigger or smaller, but it has been there has been a margin there, and so my next calculations are really around what these markets will do to that cash flow. For 2019, there's some challenges with, yes, you've got farm revenue there just under $70 billion. You've got cost of goods sold, so we're coming up to just under 60 billion. But then you've got roughly 18 billion in current liabilities. And that presents a challenge structurally of who needs the cash in there. So that just to give you a framework of that. Why this is important, though, understand that this is a game of multi steps in order to change the farm picture. When we looked at some of the offset markets and what we can deliver, the best the calculations we did, I should say, the offset market possibility is just under $5.5 billion in new revenue if all four of the markets are fully functional and the agricultural community is supplying what the markets are asking for. If we then take a look at your fertilizer use, now I've pushed this a bit far, I may get some static, but if in keeping 30% more of your fertilizer on the farm really means for every ton of fertilizer you bought, you're putting a ton of fertilizer beside the root. And you're not letting those gases escape before the roots have a chance to use them. If you can do that, that's a $1.7 billion in savings, having an impact on your cost of goods sold. And then if you take a hard look at your farm fuels, if you can knock off 20%, we've seen some good data on some talking about running your combines instead of 90%, you're running at 75% full. There's a 20% savings in the diesel use of those machines. So if you're farming straighter, you're challenging to take a hard look at the number of liters you're consuming per engine running hour, as an example, there's another $500 million in savings that would have an impact on your bottom line. So it means you're doing this over multiple, it's not just one change you're making changes in multiple areas of your farm. And that's adding to your DEPA at about 2.7 billion on the gross scale. Somewhat optimistic, and I'll certainly take the lumps for dealing with the fertilizer example, but it becomes a farm management question. The emissions question on reducing your emissions is a straight farm management exercise on the amount of fuels that you are currently consuming as a part of that. So you've got some decision desks that we're talking about. So in the Farmscape, the Canadian Federation of Agriculture, and you may have seen this in other ways, is you've got some issues of policy reward. And I would say this up front is right now the policy framework treats you as a unlevied emitter. So most of the emissions that you are currently leaving your farm aren't subject to the levy. So the emissions coming off your animals, the emissions coming off of your purple diesels, farm gas, and so forth, aren't subject to those emissions directly in what you're doing. We can have a good argument over coffee on both the upstream and downstream charges back. But from the policy reward, the industry has been given polluter non-paying status as a policy framework. And then in the economic statement at Christmas, a levy rebate was announced, and it'll be a part of your 2022 tax return, is based on how many dollars you spent on energy. There will be a rebate coming back in your farm tax return. both on what's unique about that is both on the gases that you paid a levy on, your propane and natural gas, but it will also cover your farm gases as well. So your farm gas and your farm diesel that you can also claim for that. The challenge though, and we don't have good rules, if you want to say this, is the upstream and downstream levy isn't always visible on your invoice. So it makes it very difficult to make the assumption of how much of the levy is being passed back to the farm. From a market reward, then this is part of my talk tonight, is a lot of cases in Canada, it's still early. We've got 4 different markets. We're having trouble as an industry dealing with supply. We have uncertain price signals and a whole bunch of other challenges that I'll talk about further. The other thing to understand, and I'll set the scheme here, we in large industry, particularly our food markets, but you're seeing it in other manufacturing, we're dealing with what they call scope 1, 2, and 3s. Long story short, that is a exercise that ultimately should understand the size and scope of a footprint of the greenhouse gases emitted ultimately to the final consumer. So think of it, there's a good example I can say right now. If next time you go wine shopping, go to the New Zealand wine section, you might still see some New Zealand wine that actually has a greenhouse gas footprint on the label. They've gone through the exercise of exactly how many grams of CO2e does it take.
I turn on this carbon thing while it's getting changed. It's supper time. It's family supper time.
Sounds good. Matt, if you could mute for a minute.
Oh, I'm sorry.
That's okay. Okay, so you've got upstream of what you're participating, you've got your own facility, and downstream. So no different than large industry. One of the challenges I would put out for you tonight is your own footprint needs to be understood. What are the greenhouse gases you're bringing to the farm with the things you're buying? What's your current footprint for your current farming operation? And then what are your emissions downstream until you get that product over the horizon? Why this is important is this is some of the work on dealing with the cost abatement curve and literally the cost on the farm to remove 1 ton of greenhouse gas. So how you read this graph is the purple bars are the technology pieces. So the technologies you could adopt range anywhere from feed optimization to feed additives, fertilizer timing, livestock genetics. And then as you get to the right-hand side, we're dealing with direct seeding, machinery maintenance, variable rate fertilizers, and then finally, if and when they ever show up, battery-powered tractor. The 2 lines, the red line and the green line, are to show that those are the net present value cost savings to reduce that ton of CO2e. Long story short, the left-hand side of the graph means those costs are negative, so it will cost you money to adopt those technologies on the farm unless there's an offset or some other support to change that cost to reduce the ton. And then on the right-hand side, they are currently positive without any offsets. So whether or not you're dealing with the type of nutrient you're feeding your livestock, you're adding nitrogen fixing rotations between what you're planting, you're looking at the digestibility of the feed, ultimately dealing with a reduction in greenhouse gases of enteric fermentation. Those things you can do today that are at 0, slightly positive. And the minute you go into things like machinery maintenance, your direct seeding, trying not to beat everything up after harvest, and your variable rate fertilizers, those technologies already have a positive return to your operation for every ton you reduce before you apply an offset or some other market mechanism. But what it means in more practical terms, if the challenges of your greenhouse gases are in 3 parts, really around your diesel, your gasoline, your propane, and natural gas. Those are large chunks of what's happening on your farm. and the frameworks and the markets will be dealing with those as they figure out what type of offsets or what you want to sell, or you're going to need data on the footprints caused by those. And it's no longer a gross discussion. It's really diesel liter spent per parcel and what you and how you're farming. We've got to deal also then with nitrogen emissions. So that really is dealing with fertilizer placement rate to get the best bang for our buck that way. Challenges with methane really right now without any great offset is really on your genetics and the types of animals that maintain, liters of milk produced and or cutability of your farm carcass. Dealing with the genetics, also dealing with what happens with the rumen and how it generates, or you don't want it to generate methane. And we've got to deal with the manures. So, the feeding and caring of our livestock have an impact then on the gases emitted once the animal is done with the product. And lastly, you got to save the sink, because right now the sink is shrinking by about 140,000 tons of CO2e a day. So that the farmland leaving agriculture means we no longer have the sink on a yearly basis to continue to buffer what's happening and what we're doing. As I talk about the 4 markets, the background, so we now have 4 groups of folks running around trying to figure out what they want to buy something, and ultimately you as a provider of a product, whether or not you're going to get into the 4 markets. To give you a scope of a 10,000 foot view, or if I was sitting at that honeymoon tower at Niagara Falls, you've got country to country trading. That was the Article 6 discussion that was finally settled here in Glasgow. And so now countries are going to start to build this, they've said the rules, and now the more mechanics of how countries are going to trade offsets between each other. When we look down in the Canadian perspective, the markets can be split into 2 parts. One, you have a serialized certificate that says the greenhouse gas reduction is 1 ton. And then we have a group of markets that are dealing with non-serialized certificates. If we look further down in the serialization side, we've got the regulated market. And so that's coming out of the $50 to $150 federal levy that is being paid on or by large final emitters, and they're coming to the market to buy an offset. So they really don't have to pay as much to the federal government for their emissions. And you've got a volunteer space now that's growing, both requiring serialization. And there's protocols behind them all, and then they are taking those serialized certificates that you have built as a farm and selling them into the volunteer space. On the non-serial 9, we've got cash, we've got ad space, we've got market access. We have various instruments dealing with the carbon, but a non-serialized market. And if we get either further down in the weeds, we're dealing with the Alberta market, we're dealing with the Canadian backstop markets. On the regulated side, not all provinces have a regulated market. If we're dealing with the volunteer side, we've got 3 rough. We've got the Canadian market, we've got a non-Canadian market, so we see American protocols being bought and sold here in Canada. And then we've got a great discussion on really around, are we going to be ISO based? That's a particular way of making a protocol. Or we're going to be non-ISO based. So we've got Varigold and VCR and some private Texas varieties, to say the least, of so it becomes a game of, are we always buying apples, or there'll be a discount between if one offset is made on an ISO standard and then one offset's made on the gold standard? Are they equal, or should there be a discount depending on who's buying and selling those things? On the non-serial side, you got anywhere from, you've got bonds. A really good example is Maple Leaf and their 1% premium or savings on their $2 billion letter of credit they just negotiated. And they've got to deliver for that 1% a whole series of sustainability metrics, but they got a discount on their operating loan. all the way to right now we have carbon-backed Bitcoin and non-fungible credits. So it's showing up that way. It's also showing up in the ad space. So that means it's the good green news story of EG&S's, environmental goods and services, and whether or not you're selling that or not, or there's market contracts. And lastly, when I talk about market access, this is dealing with the insetting. This is dealing with a company coming down to your farm and saying, we would like to buy the data package in addition to the corn or soybeans that you're wanting to sell. And to the point where we've got some folks like General Mills saying out loud that we require your data package in order to sell your oats to us, as an example. And then to make matters even more fun, we've got non-carbon environmental goods and services dealing with biospheres. And you've got Alice and all the other foundations running around buying management agreements to deal with the protection of biospheres. So it's, when I talk about the markets, it's not one uniform market anymore. And so it becomes complicated. And when somebody comes to your farm and say, I want to buy your carbon, it becomes a case of which market are you trading into? And right now you're going to require several binders of data depending on which one you want to enter into. But really, what's being sold? So I've tried to sum this up in a couple of places. When we're dealing with a regulated market, you're dealing with a compliance certificate. They are protocol based, and ultimately then you're dealing with the selling of a serialized certificate that emitter can then turn around and give to a regulator to say, I owe you so much money, here's cash, and here's the certificates to meet my annual emissions requirements. On the volunteer space, same requirements for the creation, they're protocol based, but then you're dealing with several $1 billion of folks wanting to buy the volunteer spaces as well. So you've got Shell, you've got Microsoft, you've got a whole roughly $4 billion in announcements that were made last year off the Chicago NASDAQ and all those, saying we need to reduce our footprint. We're on the hunt for serialized offsets. Now, the last part, as I talked about supply chains, is essentially you're selling your commodity with a data package. And finally, when we get down to Alice and our foundations and charities, you're selling personal service agreements where you as the owner are signing agreements and you're getting cash for them to change your management controls in order to keep the carbon stocks or change or keep your biosphere in the state that is prescribed in the management agreements. And right now, I would say the price confidence is going up, depending on starting with at the bottom, and then by the time you get up to serialized certificates, there's reasonably good science to suggest that those offsets did occur, and so you should see the highest price confidence at the top end. What are you expecting for price? Now I feel like I'm sitting down and tell you about what's the price of corn is going to be next year, but it's a case of our regulated market is certainly sitting at $50, and it will run out to $150 by the time you get to the 2030 framework. And to understand that the agriculture space will always trade as a discount underneath those prices. In the volunteer space, earlier this year, we finally got a futures market up and running for the Chicago Mercantile. So it's roughly trading at $8 right now, but we are seeing some private placements up as high as 24 in the World Bank sector. If your volunteer credit leaves Canada and goes into that space, depending on the project and who's wanting it, you may get up to $24 a ton. In the supply chain setting, you've got a $20 premium with the trust BICs. So when I was talking about, that's the Canadian Roundtable Sustainable Beef Program. You're selling a data package with your animal. You've gone through and paid for the trust BICs verified beef system, and so you're selling and getting paid for the data package in addition to the animal that you sold. And finally, as I said, with the personal service agreements with the charities, some of them are linked to carbon, some of them are not, but they are paying a premium for that interest in land that they are purchasing from you. So what's happening? As I said, we have on the Canadian side, Environment Canada is building a set of federal protocols. The downside to that message is they're between 18 and 24 months out before we see an approved protocol that can be transacted on the regulated market nationally. On the volunteer market, we're seeing regulated protocols now being registered in the Canadian Standards Association registry. So they're taking the conservation cropping protocol and the nitrogen reduction protocol as an example, and moving them into the volunteer space. So that's you're seeing those aggregators now out there signing options until those projects are up and running. In the case of our supply chain, the two big ones I would note are Bayer and Nutrien now are building in-house protocols. And so depending on whether or not you are a customer of those entities will depend whether or not you are dealing with their in-house offset and the farm management data that you're going to have to interact with them to accomplish that. The last thing for personal service agreements is it's all contract risk. So it's really is the price big enough for you to sign a 100-year caveat to obligate your farm or ranch to maintain those requirements. And in some of those personal service, they go beyond that, and they're now dealing with, they're offering you a trust and a conservation easement of which interest in land is taken and registered that way. One of the big things, though, I will say is there are no market controllers. There's no, as an example, there is no Canadian Grain Commission. There is no livestock sales brand inspection, as an example. So all of the price that you receive, that price holds all the bilateral risk. That's a fancy name for the buyer will discount the price as much as you can till you say no. In the fact, and then all the risk attained in that transaction is paid by the price. There's no third party entity to guarantee payment, to guarantee standard. So it's back to when, I had a variety of durum, and I'll pick on Alan, and he had his own variety of corn, and he stood up and says mine's the best, and there was no Canadian Grain Commission as an example to say that this is the standard of which I now have to achieve. A couple of things to note then when we're dealing with the offsets is, yes, farms and ranches do generate and can reduce their emissions and train their sinks, but some of the rules we kind of know, and it impacts both your price and your product that you're able to go. Big thing I put in here just to remind everybody that the levy is an emitter's cost issue. It's not a farm issue. And the offsets are designed really as a cash flow safety valve for the emitter. That's what happened here in Alberta, and that's how the federal rules are being done. They are not there to really say that you've got a new commodity, but it's showing up that way anyway. So if we deal with farm price, just like anything, you've got a bushel of soybeans to sell, and somebody's going to offer you a price. In theory, every bushel that you took off the combine, or I'll back up, every bushel that's in your field, you assume every pod and every pea will get to the bin and actually get to the market. And as you know, that doesn't always happen because you get your sieves sent wrong, or somebody might spill a little, and so on and so forth. So this is no different than this market in the fact that there is a price discount depending on how long the caveat is, whether or not it's a 1, 2, or 3 generation management agreement that obligates you to, in the case of the grassland protocol, obligates you to keep that in native range for 100 years, as an example. There are some natural reversals that happen from time to time, and the price will take a discount because of that. And right now, the market is set up that you pay for the commercialization. So the farm has the project, the farm is making the claim that I reduced my greenhouse gas, and so they pay, the farm project pays for the commission, the verification, and the serialization of that offset. It does cost you money to participate. So it means you're spending way more than you normally have, let's say in your soil tests In the case of the NERP protocol, you need good weigh evidence coming off of each of your fields. So that means you either have bought a grain cart that has the scale package with the Bluetooth collection of data, or you've got a set of farm scales close by. So every load coming off of that field is known to a high accuracy. Your yield monitor, doesn't cut it anywhere close, but that costs money to participate. Why that's important in the case of the nitrogen oxide protocol is the offsets based on the dry matter production of each of your crops. And finally, the buyer is going to be offering premiums and discounts depending on how much work they have to do to verify that the emission exists, or the emission reduction existed even after verification. On the other side, we have what produces. So the protocol at the end of the day prescribes how many tons can go into the market. And so in theory, it would be, as long as you farm this way, you should see this type of yield. And for a lot of our best managers practices, we're getting close to that. But we have to deal with management and volunteer reversals. So the protocol building process says we have to be conservative. So if there is a chance that you will have a volunteer or management reversal, you have two choices. You either take a haircut of the output to the protocol, or the other method is you have to pay for the reversal yourself. You've got to replace the ton that you just took out of the market because you decided to farm outside the parameters of the protocol. You've got to deal with natural reversals. And in the case of the federal system, this mainly impacts our grasslands, but if there's a species at risk on that place, that land is automatically disqualified as a result. So if you have other requirements that you have to do, you have to protect, or you may have sold it inadvertently with your ALICE agreement, you can't participate in those markets on that parcel. We're always going to argue about the modeled coefficients, and because we have a challenge in whether or not the project is farm-based, or you're dealing with some farm evidence and you're applying that to a model. And so that automatically means what happens in the model is not necessarily the output of what would happen on your particular farm. There is a 3% bank now federally. So 3 out of every 100 tons that get produced automatically goes into a bank system to handle natural reversals. You've got to have clear ownership. So if you got tenants and landlords, both of those parties need to be in agreement for who's gonna share the riches in selling the offsets. It is a given, and so the challenge is that there is a 100-year permanence piece. So that once the emission is happened, or once the reduction happens, it doesn't come back into the market somehow. That's the premise behind the policy framework of this. And finally, you in the legislation, so please read the fine print next time you sign a program with the federal government. Make sure that you aren't also selling your carbon offsets with that federal agreement. The legislation allows them to do that. The last thing, and so where BCC is playing a role is the issue about weights and measures. And just before you caught a bit of the conversation with Al as we're coming in, I spent some time doing this in Alberta as a part of the Farmers Advocate Office. And it's a fancy name for you need rules. What I mean by that is right now, if somebody's going to argue over the grade of soybean or grain of corn, you have an entity to say, I don't like the grade measurement, the elevator, let's go to the commission and settle this once from all exactly what the grade is. Or if somebody comes along and you do get paid after delivering your product, there is a backstop there that should cover, knock on wood, what was to be paid to you by the buyer. Those rules don't happen right now in Canada for the carbon market. So we are doing our challenging and our lobbying to ensure that there needs to be clear rules in all 4 of the markets that I've kind of covered tonight. What do we mean by rules? Well, number one, we have a consistent measure defining the credit. So in Canada, Right now in the federally regulated offset, the standard is ISO, but we have 4 now American standards creeping in, and they all slightly have a different definition of what that credit looks like. So at some point in time, we need to have you need to understand and defining exactly how is that credit being made. We do need consistent methodologies. For most part, I think for Canadian perspectives, there's a standard within the professions to do verification. But if you're dealing with an American-based protocol, you have a whole different set of standards. Clear market signals would be nice. We finally got a CME futures market to at least give you some price signal on what this market might look like. But right now it doesn't connect well with let's say the bilateral trade last week between a farmer and your local cement plant and what he paid for his regulatory. We don't see any of those market signals of exactly what the value of the offset is within the regulated market. We do need, and I said more than once, the trading and post-trading infrastructure. So that means all of the rules behind the standards that we currently enjoy in selling and buying bonds, selling and buying commodities, selling and buying grain and livestock. All of those pieces of legislation we currently enjoy. That means, you can't sell a cow on a handshake. You really do need to put it on paper. Yeah, there are rules. The Canadian Grain Commission has rules around delivery, so on and so forth. Those don't exist. And so those are also needed within this marketplace. We also have to understand the proper use of the offset, and that means exactly you've got a commodity and where is it going. So is it backed? In the case of, if you were to get into these new fungible credits, they are trading, but just like a derivative, there's an underlying offset that actually backs that all up. Or in the case of a mortgage derivative, there is a real house somewhere that has a real mortgage attached. And it's the cash flow that you've created the derivative around coming out of the house owner, making payments on his mortgage. Market safeguards. So as I said, it would be nice to add carbon to the Canadian Grain Commission, but we'll hold my breath on that one. Might say unicorn first, and then finally, standards of contracts in all 4 of the markets. So understanding what the buying, what the selling, what the act of God says, who settles. Are we dealing with a Canadian court, an Ontario court, or do you have to go to a Texas court? Because that's where the aggregator is located to enforce the terms of the contract. So it gets messy legally without a standard set of contract terms. Saw this the other day, and so this is what I mean. You've got this particular aggregator out there in the volunteer space, happened to put out a price quote of $10.28 an acre. And I'll protect them a little bit, but I'll say out loud that knowing what I know from the marketplace, where he's going to have a hard time coming up with that return net to a farmer at the current price. We know that the conservation cropping protocol and NERP protocol they're offering only delivers, 0.31 tons an acre. That means he's going to have to return pre-commission somewhere in the range of 57.25 US a ton out of the marketplace. But we know it trades at 8, so that means somehow he has figured out a positive basis of $49.25 a ton. I don't think the marketplace is delivering that. So what I think is what's happening is he's delivering 2 pieces of information and data and packages. There, you may be able to get a $2.26 an acre return pre-commission on the carbon side, depending on that yield and then between the fertilizer and other agronomic things that they're offering, you may get another $8.24 an acre boost off the product to come up with $10.28. But they're very, very clear from the carbon market itself, that price is really difficult to achieve out of the market. And so what I mean by the weights and measures and rules is that when you're dealing with offers of sale and at the fact that if he were to sign a contract for 1028, it would be no different than selling a soybean contract. And if you delivered the ton, you should get 1028 in your hand, and the risk for delivery and generations coming from the company. You're not under the gun to say, well, yes, sir, you filed an agreement with us for 1028, but the market doesn't deliver, so we're only going to pay you 2. That's the risk that we've saw in the past out here, and that we're trying to avoid and deal with. It also means, getting down to the farm level, you need good farm data. And it's going from having how many liters of diesel, or I should back up, to pick on you, fellow, the fact that you got to know more than the $10,000 or $20,000 or $50,000 you spent on diesel last year. You really need to know how many liters were consumed on that parcel, because it's the parcel then that's making the claim. So I've had just that I was coming in, and I'll share with you a small joke that I was trying to look up the farm that your operation has, and I couldn't quite see it, so I picked on another farm just outside the same town to try to give you an understanding what I mean. With today's GPS technologies, you now have the ability to start to understand at a per acre basis, or at least through that GPS location, what's happening in a stacked level of information. So you've got fertility, soil carbon, all taken to at least 30 centimeters, and if not lower, GPS location. So you now know what's happening both on a fertility basis and a carbon basis and a bulk density basis of what's happening on the field that you're managing. And then once you start to add in your farm straighter technology, your auto steer, and trying to lower the total kilometers you've passed over that field, you're trying to eliminate as much overlap as possible. You're trying not to seed and fertilizer 3 times over the same space. You've got a great understanding of the diesel being used, the fertilizer being applied down to the root. You've got weight scales either on the bags that you're bringing in, or you got each of those corn containers have a weight scale as well, so you actually know the weight of the fertilizer going into the ground. And so that becomes another set of data that the protocols in the market so is starting to ask for. Once you get to the combine, you've got data and combined with a weight scale at the corner of the field. Some of these new, like I see the red one here, their new case management system will tell you how many liters per running hour of your diesel use. And if you've got a set of weight scales, you're now understanding the dry matter yield of each of those commodities that's coming off. And because they're now geo-referenced, you now know, you can now start to layer on that same GPS of where you took the soil sample. And lastly, with the new, I'll pick on Massey again, but with the new data management unit that's attached to some of their new balers, you now know the fodder weight coming off the field. And so that also then deals with you're now into the fodder as a commodity. You're moving that into the biodiesel plant or however we're using it, but you also not to better understand that. And I'll get to the chat here just in a minute. And lastly, you've got a hard understanding in the case of your animals and manure, exactly what's happening to those emissions and how can you lower them, because you're also understanding the barn heat and the barn cooling cycles. So you're dealing with the total energy use coming off of that whole parcel as an example, both in your methane and nitrogen oxide release, and where can you control it and where can you deal with it. What does the chat say here? How would this data be verified by a third party? Does it mean the type in there, Alan, you mean by the one I just covered?
It's my son asked the question, it's how would that data be verified coming off the weight scale on the grain buggy?
Okay, so in the case of the weigh scale, to start with, you are capturing the weight And at worst, you are recording it manually. You know, you get a binder. At best, you have, with those load cells, a computer system that records and stores in a secure location, whether it's on the cloud or someplace that you can't jerry rig it, so that the data is there for the verifier to come in. What the verifier does is the protocol says you need these pieces of evidence, and the protocol prescribes it, and the verifier comes in and roughly says, is the data there, and is it in this? It is in the format that the protocol says it should be. If that is a yes, then that at the end of the day, the verification passes. If the data is not there, you know, you can't see it, or it's in a particular state that's subject to changes before you lock it down, then often the verification fails. So the best case scenario with your weights is you are dealing with an industry grade scale that captures and secures that data. It's got a timestamp, so on and so forth. And you have the ability to attach it to that particular field. I have been asked the question, well, why can't I use my sales certificates? You know, I took the grain and put it in the bin, but eventually took it down the road and sold it. So why can't I use that weight? The marketplace deals with vintages, and across a lot of farms across Canada, you are storing grain over years. And so it is difficult once you start to mix and measure your bins, is that can you absolutely guarantee that the corn you just sold came from your 2020 crop, came off of that particular field? And so that's the challenge in your weight and measure. And then on the input side, you're starting to hunt for your seeders that have weigh scales, and if not, very pragmatically, you've got a load cell where you seed up every time, and you are weighing those bags before you put them in, so you have an accurate measurement of the fertilizer going in the seeder before you are metering it out across the field. All right. So what I mean by that is, what I was trying to get across here is down at the bottom, I've got your nice blue field of what we just talked about. You've got a GPS location. And so now you start to layer that GPS layer of what your soil tests are telling you. As I said, for fertility and soil, you've now got your emission sinks and data, because you now have from all of your different units what your diesel use and what your fertilizer placement is happening. You've now got GPS reference cost data, because you now know your diesel, as I said, your where you're spending your time and effort and money. You've got from your combine and other sources, you've got a GPS based farm yield and revenue data. And if you can get that far, depending on how you're handling your biomass post harvest, you've got other data. So you start to end up with this layered approach of all the different pieces of data that the scope 1, 2, and 3 folks are starting to ask for. And you're building your baseline, and then you're trying to figure out what the delta is. Once you've built that baseline, every year you go out there. Got another question. How many years is a field signed up for? That really depends on the contract, Alan. For most part, the protocols are created after the fact. So if you've gone through a production cycle and you finish that production cycle, and the protocol says, in the case of the conservation cropping protocol, the cycle starts the minute the harvest comes off and goes all the way back to harvest. All of the interactions with the farm, all of the planting, all of the post tillage after harvest, all deal with that vintage year. So it's dependent, and that's laid out in the protocol. In some of our livestock protocols, they are for the life of the animal. So they are vintage that way. So it's down to the answer to your question. It's really based on the protocol and the project you're dealing with. I see one more chat. Is there a positive credit for you? Yes. Short answer, Steve, yes. is that with the 4R program and the NERP protocol, having those nitrogen stabilizers added to the 4R program is a part of the 4R protocol. So the NERP protocol outlines that you have to use a coated fertilizer as an example to transact on. It's a non-starter if you're entering the 4R fertilizer program, but not using a coated fertilizer as an example. So as I get close here, Alan, I would leave it at this. We've often said, you know, you got to bring receipts to what you're doing to the game because the buyers are wanting receipts. And so the farm management challenge is how do you do that on a cost-effective method that not only meets their needs, but also meeting your farm management needs to try to squeeze, you know, one more dollar out of what you're trying to do. Thank you for your time, Alan. I'll open it up for questions, give or take, but I would say thank you. Bioelectrical Carbon Canada is there. We would invite all of you to be members because we are doing this to good old-fashioned farm manager extension, and we're trying to get you prepared to the markets we think are coming. Tomorrow, I guarantee, will be slightly different. But we're trying to ensure that the rules that you're trading in exist. You've got a commodity that you can sell. The buyers treat you fairly, and ultimately you're enjoying a new commodity in addition to the soybeans, corn, or whatever you're trying to grow. So thank you for your time, Alan, and I'll open it up for a more robust question and answer. Thank you.
I have a question for you, Graham.
Yeah.
The example of Maple Leaf getting that $2 billion operating loan with a 1% discount. Do you know what they're actually asking their producers? What kind of data they want out of their producers to do business with Maple Leaf?
It's kind of like reading the tea leaves, but yes, they started with their scope 2s, and they spent a fair amount of time in their manufacturing site to understand and drop their emissions at site. So that was the easiest piece. They are engaged with the trucking industry as they're moving those products out, whether or not those truckers have skirts, those truckers have single fats. And so they're starting to amend their trucking contracts to deal with then you know, the scope down to when you finally get the bake in the market, as an example. On the producer side, they're starting those discussions with the barns, particularly on the barns where they own the animals, and then they're leasing the barn facilities. They are challenging, they're redoing the feeding agreements. They're changing they're taking the science we saw by feeding pulses to pigs, and they're adding those rations. So ultimately then they're changing the diets, resulting in less emissions. So at the end of the day, they are going as far down as the folks growing the pigs, and they're changing their contracts.
Okay.
What I can't tell you, though, to answer your question, is we know it happened because it was a syndicate that placed the bond into the market, and that's how they got it. And so I can answer is what was that discussion between the syndicated banks going into the bond market to sell the mortgage to give Maple Leaf the reduced premium or reduced interest rate, because that roughly means somewhere down the system at the purchase side, somebody's taking a slightly less interest on that bond in return for some goodie. So if they don't come through and deliver against it, then I can't see what's being publicly traded, what penalty or what premium would have triggered if they don't meet it, you know, as an example. And how does that benefit the bondholder? Oh, you're on mute.
The bondholder's taking a 1% reduction in interest. You think that's at the moment that's just making that person or that corporation feel better?
I can't answer that, but there's a reasonable assumption that they made that choice. So the question really becomes, if Maple Leaf doesn't deliver, what's the honey? I can't think of a better name for it, that the bondholder will get should Maple Leaf fail.
Correct. You don't know that then.
I don't know that.
Okay.
I'm surmising.